In this talk, I'm not going to be talking about, I'm not interested, at least directly, in the lives of kings and queens. In some ways, I think we understand very well the lives of the powerful and their hopes and their desires. And I think we, as historians, all too often, if I may say, dance to the tunes of the ancient court poets who wrote in order to glorify their ancient masters and exalted their power, wisdom, and wealth. And I think we often fail to look behind the thin veil of poetry and propaganda to see the true picture of these patrons of the art. I am much more interested in the lives of ordinary people. What did ordinary people eat? What were their work conditions? How did they live? Could they marry? How many children did they have? What was the mortality rate of infants? I think those questions much better illustrate the reality of the ancient states that I study. And the ancient states that I study are those that existed in Iraq from the dawn of history in the middle of the 4th millennium BC until the time of Alexander's conquest of Babylon in 331 BC. So that is, in the words of my predecessor in Oxford, I do half of human history and I leave the other half to the others in the university. I'm inspired by Jacob Riis, who documented the life of New York's poor. Jacob Riis had grown up in Ribe, a town in southern Denmark, in the middle of the 19th century. And Ribe, if anyone has visited, is a beautiful provincial city with a cathedral and a school and an emerging middle class. And I think it was a far cry from New York of the turn of the century when Jacob Riis documented the tenements, life in the tenements with his friend Theodore Roosevelt. And I think the conflict must have been on his mind during his work. I'm also influenced by something my old PhD supervisor once said to me: if you can't narrate the events that you're reconstructing, then you have not understood them yet. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to trace the lives of individuals on the bottom of society. They appear once in a text, perhaps to resurface once more in a different text a few years later, and are then lost to us forever. This is, of course, in direct contrast to the lives of the elites, which we can often trace generation after generation. Nevertheless, in this very brief talk, I'll try and put together a hypothetical few days in one person's life in ancient Iraq. My sources are all from the so-called Third Dynasty of Ur, a dynasty which lasted 80 years and extended its powers over much of southern and northeastern Iraq, as well as western Iran. The scribes of this state produced a truly staggering amount of administrative documents. Some 100,000 are catalogued, making the period one of the best documented periods in the history of the ancient world. Let us start the day in the field, and let us invent a fictitious character, a worker, by the name Ur-Lugal, which is a real Sumerian name, which is well attested for both low and high, meaning the dark of the king. And dark here, of course, is the servant or the slave of the king. And let us suggest first that he was a member of the work team described in this text from the Yale Babylonian collection, employed at cutting reed. Each worker in this group had to cut a staggering 540 square meters of reed a day. Similar work obligations existed for other types of work. Perhaps Ur-Lugal was still able to make a little on the side and better his life a bit. Perhaps he was always up at the call with an hour and a half all to himself before work. Time for a man who knew his way around to earn a bit on the side, to quote Solzhenitsyn. But fortunes turn, and one day Ur-Lugal would have had an accident at work or simply fallen ill. We don't know if Ur-Lugal was beaten by his overseer, but we know that his overseer was directly financially responsible for the production of his team and could lose both family and life over unfulfilled obligations. In fact, Ur-Lugal's illness may have been a blessing for his overseer, who received full credit for Ur-Lugal's missing performance. That is not the best way to present overseers from pushing workers to the brink. One day, let's imagine Urlugal had had enough and got up and fled. Flight is well attested during this period, as the text behind me proves, and although we can show that in some years 5 to 10% of work teams fled, too little has been preserved to allow for real statistical analysis of the level of flight. Urlugal ran to the marshes, the vast expanse of wetlands covering southern Iraq and southwestern Iran. The Iraqi marshes teemed with fowl and fish and small animals and was a natural refuge for all fugitives throughout Mesopotamia's long history and in modern times as well. The marshes, now only a shadow of their former glory, lies between Iraq and Iran in this time was known as Elam. Ur, the capital in the third dynasty of Ur, controlled the capital city of Elam called Susa, and messengers were constantly on their way between the center Ur and the city of Susa. Many of these messengers were accompanied by military staff, some who had the explicit task of capturing runaways. These lynch gangs, called men-catching fugitives, or lu sachdabdabde in Sumerian, were made up of soldiers, often with relations at court. Our Urlugal may have remained at large for some time. Let's say he was on the run for 1 year before being captured. When captured, poor Urlugal came into direct contact with the glorious state that we read about in the royal inscriptions and the literature. Urlugal was dragged to the court, probably an open air area somewhere in the main temple complex. This place is poetically described in the slightly older cylinder of Gudea. There we read about Shugalam, the terrible place, the place of rendering justice, the place of God Ningirsus looking on all the lands. What to the rulers was a glorious place was truly a frightening place to our old Urlugal. There they examined Urlugal. They made him swear, and here I would like to follow closely the information from the legal document here on the screen behind me. They made him swear an oath on the life of the king that, on the day I flee a third time, may I be destroyed. To me, this is one of the most moving quotes from a text from ancient Mesopotamia. The poor worker, toiling day after day in the fields, who fled his place in a work team, is dragged back to work by the men of the kings and is forced to promise his own destruction, physical destruction, mind you, should he ever flee again. But Urlugal was not destroyed. And most surprisingly for ancient societies, he was kept alive for a while in what can be described as a prison, or at least under guard. He may have stayed there for a few weeks or a month before he was eventually returned to the work crew he had recently fled from. Many texts attest to this reintroduction into the workforce of runaway workers. Urlugal wasn't executed, he wasn't mutilated that we know of, but was simply put back to work in the team he had originally left. I want to end with a very special text. Once, in a bid to promote the cuneiform collection, these are cuneiform texts, the cuneiform collection in the Asmolean Museum, I was asked whether we had something like the Cyrus cylinder in our collections. This request was, of course, based on the general assumption that the Cyrus cylinder is a first charter of human rights. That is particularly or patently not the case, and I suggested instead a scrappy little literary text known as the Hymn to Nungal. Nungal was, among other things, the goddess of the prison. Now, the text is framed as a divine hymn, extolling the virtues of the recipient, the god Nungal, but behind that literary coating, the text appears to be a very humanistic answer to capital punishment by a scribe sentenced to death. And let me read this excerpt of the text. When someone has been brought into the palace of the king, and this man is accused of a capital offense, my chief prosecutor Nin Dimgul stretches out his arm in accusation. He sentences that person to death, but he will not be killed. He snatches the man from the jaws of destruction and brings him into my house of life, which is the temple of Nungal, the prison, and keeps him under guard. My house gives birth to a just person, but exterminates a false one. When it has polished him clean like silver of good quality, when it has cleansed him of dirt like silver of best quality, he will be entrusted again into the proprietor's hands of his God. Then may the God of this man praise me appropriately forever. This text, of course, does not address the life situation of Ur-Lugal, who could not read or write, and who may not even have known who Nungal was. But it highlights something very human in us all, perhaps also found in the legal text I quoted previously, namely a deep-seated instinct for self-preservation. Ur-Lugal swears an oath not to run away, and rather goes back to toiling for the state than being destroyed. And the scribe of the hymn to Nungal praises the prison to avoid a death sentence. I think the hymn to Nungal was probably considered a bit too special for the purpose of promoting the Asmolean collection, and we therefore used the spectacular Sumerian king list instead, but I still regret it. Thank you for your attention.